picture when it says a webinar is now streaming live on YouTube. Do I watch it on YouTube?
No, you stay here.
I don't think so. I mean, if you're watching it there, just watch it. Is it coming through?
Yeah.
You're fine. You'll just turn off your camera and your microphone so that we just see Alma when she's ready.
Oh, I see you've hit recording button. Is this going to actually be posted afterwards?
No, it's not usually posted. It's just people who missed something or they ask to re-see it. If you would like a recording of it, I know that one of our other speakers asked for a recording. It's unlisted on YouTube so that it's on our channel if we need to call it up for anything.
Okay, so it would just be for like on-demand people just because I'm giving lots of other book talks and I don't want to like repeat the same, have it available already online if I'm giving
For sure not. But you know, if somebody had to leave early.
Sure, no problem.
So, but no, we will not post it to the public.
Perfect, thank you.
It's unlisted.
Perfect, thank you so much.
Well, thank you all for coming. We're just getting a little set up here. So I know we don't see you, but I know that you're there. So I'm going to leave for a moment while she gets set up.
I just want to make sure I have host function. You there?
In just a moment, I'm going to check.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, you should have sharing functions.
Okay, great. Oh yeah, I see how it would work. All right, yeah, just let me know whenever. Oops, sorry, I didn't mean to share it then.
No, share it. You might as well if you have, unless is it your first slide already?
Yeah, it's just an introductory slide. So you just let me know whenever you want to begin.
Okay. Let's give everybody 2 minutes. I usually start 5 minutes.
I'm not in a rush. Yeah. How's everything in New York for those of you in New York?
Oh, they can't answer you unless they put it in chat. So those of you who are here, I'm going to repeat it again, but please answer in chat actually where you're from, because that always makes it interesting.
Yes.
If you put into chat where you're from and say hello.
Well, I'm personally coming in from California. So it's about 3 hours earlier, and I'm glad that this is starting at the civil hour of 9 a.m. my time, because we had MESA not too long ago, the Middle East Studies Association meetings, and it was starting at 8 a.m. my time for most of those.
Well, that's not so bad either. It could be worse.
Oh, I am not a morning person. So this is an hour makes a huge difference. An hour makes a huge
That's what we try to do, because I'm actually in Israel now.
Oh,
so
wow.
Try to make
what time is it for you?
Across the board. Well, I mean, I live here now. So.
Yeah, but what time is it there now?
Now it's only 6 because we changed our clocks and you didn't.
I see. Yeah. Because normally it's like a 10-hour difference.
Now it's a 9-hour difference, yeah.
Right, yeah.
Because I have a daughter out there, so I know.
Oh, okay, nice. New Yorker, New Jersey, New York.
And Ronnie's here from New York too. Oh, I know where Marla's from. Hi, Marla. And New Jersey. Okay. So we can get started. We have a majority of the people who registered here, so I think we can get started. And it is my pleasure to welcome all of you. and particularly Dr. Heckman today. And she herself had actually, I met her 2 years ago at our Moroccan conference in New York, something like that. I can't keep track of time with this corona, I'm sorry, but at our Moroccan conference, and she was working on her book then, finishing it up, and gave part of the presentation there, and I look forward to hearing more of it now, so that's exciting. She herself is the chair of Holocaust, Neufeld-Levin, there you go, that's what I was missing. The Neufeld-Levin Chair of Holocaust Studies and Assistant Professor of History and Jewish Studies at the University of California, Santa Cruz, which we just discussed that she is sitting in California right now. And I'm gonna, instead of me introducing her book, I think it's better if she gets started and she gives you more information. Please be aware that your microphones and cameras are off. So if you do want to speak to anybody, please put it into the chat if it's something directed at me or some type of technical thing. And if it's a question for Dr. Heckman, then please put it into the Q&A and we'll read them off at the end. Either you can or I'll read it to you. You tell me what you prefer.
Okay, great.
So without further ado, I would love to hear it. So let's begin.
Awesome. Okay, well, I'm going to share my screen. Perfect. You should be seeing the starts of a PowerPoint. And now you should be seeing the whole thing. Is it showing up?
Yes, that's
Perfect.
right.
All right, so here you can see the cover art, which I would love to take credit for, but all I did was supply an archive image to the team at Stanford University Press, so they actually designed this. But anyway, first and foremost, I'd like to thank you, Drora, and the ASF for inviting me to give this talk, and to all of you for attending. So I'll speak for about 35, 40 minutes. And I'm going to try to walk you through an overview of the book, some of its main arguments, some of its main interest points. And I'd like to start with the question of how I first got interested in this topic. So back in 2009, I had first graduated from college. I had become very interested in Jewish history of North Africa and the Middle East, thanks to people like Fran Molino, who I believe is attending today. And also Jane Gerber's work as well. And based off of that interest, I had applied for a Fulbright to go to Morocco for academic year 2009-2010. And there I was really researching all sorts of things having to do with Jewish life. It wasn't particularly focused. I think they were very generous with me in terms of a grant proposal, because I basically said I wanted to do everything from looking at cemeteries to oral history. And as part of that time, I volunteered at a Jewish museum in Casablanca that was run by somebody named Simone Levy, who I would learn was one of the towering figures of modern Moroccan Jewish political history. But before I get to him, even before I met Simone Levy, I was struck by a verbal distinction that I would hear all the time when I talked to people around Morocco about what I was researching. And I noticed this verbal distinction between Moroccan and the necessary qualifier Moroccan Jew, right? I mean, yes, the country is over 99% Muslim. The vast majority of its population is Muslim, and very few Jews remain in Morocco today. But even when speaking about the historical past, I found it very interesting that there was this always necessary qualification of Moroccan Jew, and Moroccan was assumed to be Muslim. And I started asking myself that question around the time when I was meeting Simone Levy, who had this Jewish museum and told me about his life in politics as a high-ranking member of the Moroccan Communist Party, which is something I had never heard of before. And according to Simone Levy, Moroccan meant Jewish and Muslim simultaneously. You couldn't have Moroccan without a Jewish qualifier, or you couldn't have Moroccan without Muslim, and that the two work together to create a holistic sense of modern Moroccan-ness. And if you've been to the museum or are interested in the sort of argument that the museum puts forth, it's really one of absolute synthesis of Jewishness and Moroccan-ness, that the two cannot be distinguished from one another. And so when I was talking with Simone Levy, I began to wonder how exceptional he was. How exceptional was it to have this Jewish person who was so involved in communist politics? It was something I'd never, ever heard of before. And so this book is really the result of about 10 years of inquiry since that time, sparked by the conversations and interviews that I conducted with Simone Levy. And in addition to oral histories, archival research really spans the globe between Morocco, France, Israel, the United States, the United Kingdom, and in all sorts of different languages, including French, Arabic, Hebrew, Spanish, English, as well as Judeo-Arabic, and even some Hakitiya, which is Moroccan Judeo-Spanish. In addition to oral histories, I also had the benefit of looking at oral histories as well as personal archives. So not only state-run archives, colonial archives, but also personal papers, including the personal papers of Simone Levy. And it's really thanks to the generosity of so many that I was able to do this project. And you'll see, if you do buy the book, you'll see that the acknowledgements are one of its longer chapters as a result of all of those people's generosity. So this book in and of itself is the first book to examine Jewish participation in Morocco's anti-colonial movement and the problems of political and social belonging that Jews faced not only during colonial rule, but after the end of colonial rule as well. And today, as I said, I want to walk you through the main narrative arc of the book, as well as its main arguments and interventions. And I really do look forward to your questions, because I'm going to be going over a big sort of gloss of material, and there's lots of fun detail to pull out. Overall, The Sultan's Communist presents the untold story of Jewish radicals' involvement in Morocco's national liberation project from French and Spanish colonial rule and its afterlife. The chapters extend from the beginning of leftist movements and demographic upheaval in the 1920s through the high point of Jewish political activism in the immediate post-World War II period to Morocco's repressive post-independence political history in the 1970s. And I conclude with a discussion of the 1990s and the Moroccan state's lionization of its Jewish past. This scope, encompassing both the colonial and the Cold War contexts, bring into view the connections between the demographic and ideological shifts within both Morocco's Jewish population, as well as Moroccanized communism, all within the context of the power of the Moroccan state. As such, this book is simultaneously a history of Moroccan Jewish communists and more broadly, a history of Morocco and its Jews in the 20th century. Fundamentally, this book is about a minority within a minority, Jews in the Moroccan Communist Party, and how they became the most famous of Moroccan Jews. In short, this is a story of how a small group of people gained prominence, both within Morocco and internationally, in ways that conferred benefits on all parties involved. Unearthing this story sheds light on the very mechanics of colonialism and anti-colonial agitation, the history of Zionism in the Middle East and North Africa, which I'm going to refer to as the MENA for its acronym from now on, as well as its detractors, and the formation of a modern nation state out of a colonial legacy and the Jewish role within that process. Finally, studying Moroccan Jewish communists demonstrates the possibility of Jewish patriotism in the MENA long after independence and regional wars with Israel that contributed to the massive Jewish exodus from so much of the Middle East and North Africa, including Morocco, during the 1960s and 1970s. My main arguments are as follows: that the story of Morocco's Jewish communists is both exceptional and emblematic of the history of Jews in Morocco and of the history of Moroccan political life across the years of colonial occupation into independence and the Cold War. The legitimacy of the Makhzen, which is a term in Moroccan Arabic that refers to the centralized Moroccan state, the legitimacy of the Makhzen of Jews as Moroccans and of the Moroccan Communist Party is, quote, authentic to the values of Moroccanness, all came to support and serve one another. While bolstering their mutual legitimacy, the Makhzen and Jewish communists also proved each other's Moroccan authenticity. As the book's chapters demonstrate, a triangulation of historical contingencies and necessities ultimately enabled both Jewish communists and the Makhzen to combat a legacy of colonial sectarian politics through one another. Each aimed to restore, according to the nationalist narrative, the pre-colonial and pre-Zionist patriotic harmony between Muslims and Jews, loyal subjects of the Sultan turned king, the commander of the faithful, and the protector of, quote, his Jews. And the book's narrative follows the lives of 5 prominent Moroccan Jewish communists. Oh, whoops, I meant to put this up earlier, but here's Simone Levy in front of that museum, so you get a little bit of the picture of this kind of larger than life man. Okay, here are the individuals' names. So the book narrative follows Leola Sultan, born 1905, dies 1945. Edmond Amran El-Maleh, 1917, dies in 2010. Abraham Serfati, 1926 to 2010. Simone Levy, who I've talked about a lot, 1924 to 2011. And Sion Asidon, born in 1948, still alive and active. And the chronology of these figures' lives roughly maps onto the thematic content of each of the chapters. And I'm going to return to these figures in a little bit, but first I want to provide some background. And why is this not working? Oops. There we are, background and context. So here you have a map of Morocco, just as a quick refresher. And I should say that most of the story I tell takes place in Casablanca, here on the coast. And this little bar is at least blocking my view, but mostly it's a Casablanca story. One of the book's central arguments has to do with a few pre-colonial paradigms governing Jewish life in Morocco, and the way in which those paradigms became challenged and ultimately resurrected by both communist Jews and the Moroccan state in the run-up to independence from colonial rule and after. And those paradigms, which you might already be familiar with, I'll explain very quickly, are as follows. The first is dhimmi status. Dhimmi literally translates to protected status, and it refers to the legal status of Jews, Christians, and Zoroastrians under Muslim rule. It's important to note that that status is very flexible over time and space, and it both entails restrictions and protections under Muslim rule. The second paradigm has to do with convivencia. You might have heard that term in the context of medieval Muslim Spain, and this idea of convivencia, or living together, a kind of harmonious understanding of Jewish, Christian, Muslim life in medieval Spain. And the next paradigm is the Sultan's Jew, made famous by Daniel Schrader in my field. He wrote a great book about 20 years ago called The Sultan's Jew, from which my title is a directly riff, The Sultan's Communist, because I take his idea, the sort of proprietary nature of the relationship between the Jewish community and the Makhzen, the sense that the Jews could be a resource of the Makhzen, representing Morocco abroad, in the sense of loyalty and political representation that Jews could serve for the Makhzen. Colonial rule is one of the most important backdrops for all of this. French and Spanish protectorates would come to dominate the Moroccan landscape as of 1912, and that colonial protectorate status would last until 1956, the year of independence. And that period of colonial rule would fundamentally disrupt those paradigms that I was just mentioning, of dhimmi status, of convivencia, of the Sultan's Jew. Mind you, those paradigms are mythologies unto their own right? They don't necessarily represent a truth or a representative of stability of Jewish life. They're stories, they're mythologies that are deployed for different political purposes at different points in time. But colonial rule would disrupt those pre-existing paradigms and narratives. And colonial rule itself followed institutions like the Alliance Israélite Universelle, which I'll explain a bit more in a second, which had already begun to act as a wedge between Jews and Muslims in Morocco. And I'll explain the AIU just shortly. And this is part of what I reference in the book's title, the so-called politics of belonging. How did Moroccan Jews belong to the Moroccan nation? And how did that relationship of belonging change over time? And I really became interested in this sense of a proprietary relationship between the Sultan, who became redubbed the king after independence, and his Jews, both pre and post-colonial rule. Contestations over the so-called politics of belonging were at the heart of imperialist incursions in Morocco, as well as before the establishment of the protectorate. French power, of course, had already been growing in Morocco and North Africa more broadly since the beginning of the 19th century. French Jewish politics and the colonial mission civilisatrice, or civilizing mission, also extended into Morocco in the work of the Alliance Israélite Universelle long before the formalization of the Protectorate Treaty. And the Alliance itself encouraged the formation of new Jewish political subjectivities and inevitably politicized identities. The Alliance itself was a French Jewish philanthropic educational network founded in 1860 to help Jews of the Middle East and North Africa, as well as European Ottoman lands, to, quote, regenerate. And regeneration, quote unquote, was one byword for that mission civilisatrice, that civilizing mission I mentioned, based on the prevailing European Orientalist and colonial logic that the peoples of Muslim majority lands had somehow stalled or regressed in their development while Europe had supposedly advanced. The purported goal of the civilizing mission was thus to regenerate, quote unquote, the subject of the Middle East and North Africa into an evolved or évolué subject, at least according to those French imperialist standards. The Alliance did that by establishing an extensive network of schools, and its first school took root in the northern Moroccan city of Tétouan in 1862. And just a few years later, by 1895, the Alliance boasted 70 schools and nearly 17,000 students, all the way from Morocco to Iran. But critically, for the purposes of my book, regeneration also meant deracination. In the process of becoming évolué, in speaking and thinking in French, the Alliance curriculum was almost entirely in French, with some exceptions. In becoming entrenched in French history and geography with a sprinkling of Jewish studies, students became divorced from their home languages and home customs. Alliance pupils often found themselves, in the words of Albert Memmi, à cheval entre deux civilisations, that is to say, straddling two worlds, unable to be fully of the home community of their non-Alliance educated parents or their Muslim neighbors, nor fully accepted as fully French or European. Indeed, in a cruel twist of irony, the very organization that was motivated by the zeal of citizenship and emancipation in France made it much more difficult for Jews of the Middle East and North Africa to be ultimately embraced as local or authentic citizens as movements for national independence eventually developed. So fundamentally, French colonial policy and institutions redefined and challenged Jews' relationships to Muslims in the Maghreb, meaning North Africa, which would be significant in developing nationalist platforms and models of patriotic citizenship. And this problem of authenticity, of Moroccanness, of belonging, of legitimacy, all of these things would come to inform the motivations of the figures that I explore in this book and their political motivations against the background of massive political upheaval. Okay, so here's our first figure, Leola Sultan. Under colonial rule, many individuals, including colonial officers, Muslims, and Jews themselves, saw Moroccan Jews as somehow complicit with colonization, and this include the offices of the Alliance. As a result also of Jews' French education, they tended to have higher access to French bureaucracy, governing bureaucracy. And as a result, had a disproportionate amount of access to the French hierarchy. But at the same time, there was a rising tide of anti-Semitism in the interwar period as well as earlier, both among French colonial authorities, Spanish colonial authorities in the northern zone, and to a smaller extent among Muslims as well. And this really caught Jews in a sort of betwixt and between position in many different ways. The Moroccan Communist Party itself had arrived in the country in the early 20th century, and it really came as a result of infrastructure opportunities. With the establishment of the French Protectorate in 1912, the French colonial authorities launched on a huge number of infrastructural projects, including the port of Casablanca, including the massive railway networks, including mining operations across the country, and many others. And those infrastructural opportunities encouraged a large number of poorer Europeans to migrate to the French colonial world of North Africa to work on those projects. And this is where we get figures like Encarnacion Levy. Encarnacion Levy would ultimately be the wife of Simone Levy, who I started with earlier, but she ultimately converted to Judaism. But she was the daughter of Spanish Protestants who were deeply poor, migrated at first to Algeria, the story goes, because they misread the sign on a boat or misheard the call. They meant to go to Argentina, and in fact, they ended up in North Africa. Encarnacion Levy's mother sold horse meat on the dock of Casablanca with a side of socialist propaganda. And I tell you that story because they were one of many, many kinds of people doing the same thing. There were a lot of already politicized Spanish activists, French activists, Italian leftist activists that converged on these big industrial zones. At the same time, Jews and Muslims from the more rural hinterlands were converging also on colonial opportunities and employment opportunities that places like Casablanca represented. So what we ended up having is Jews, Muslims, and these already leftist socialist individuals rubbing shoulders in places like canning factories, on the railroad lines, and the ports. So we have that sort of exposure, and the French state tried its best to prohibit that. And in fact, they banned Jews and Muslims from attending socialist meetings, but in practice, it was very difficult to actually enforce that kind of ban. And Jews and Muslims became involved in leftist politics for a number of different reasons, but I'll focus on Jews. In the interwar period, right, with that rising tide of anti-Semitism and with the rising menace of fascism, not only in Europe, but also across North Africa and in the Middle East, Jews became drawn to the anti-fascist rhetoric of organizations like the Moroccan Communist Party and others to push back against that tide of fascism and anti-Semitism. And during the interwar period, meaning the period between World War I and World War II, Moroccan Jews were drawn to a wide variety of political affiliations, and it was possible for them to be simultaneously Zionist, pro-France, as well as communist. And that kind of fluidity would no longer be possible in this post-Second World War period, but critically it was then. And this figure I have featured here, Leola Sultan, was one of those. He contributed to Zionist organizations. He was a founding member of the Moroccan Communist Party. He was born, interestingly, in Algeria, so he had French citizenship by virtue of the Cruz decree before migrating to Casablanca. And so he represented that wave of fluidity of the interwar period. Okay. And so the anti-fascist activism itself came about in response to a number of things, not only the rise of Nazism in Germany, but also the Spanish Civil War, very critically, just across the Straits of Gibraltar, and Franco's fascism and Franco's partnership with Nazi Germany increased the volume of Nazi propaganda available in Morocco. And this spurred anti-fascist Jews and Muslims to join leftist organizations. And a number of these organizations actually overlapped within a kind of popular front umbrella of the Moroccan Communist Party. So that's the backdrop to a critical moment during the Second World War period. So as many of you may know, France fell to Nazi Germany early in the summer of 1940, and the Vichy regime that then came about, so named from the Vichy spa town in the so-called unoccupied zone in the south, the Vichy regime really represented a betrayal of a lot of the kind of universalizing Republican French emancipatory promises that organizations like the Alliance Israélite Universelle had really tried to convince Jews of. It was this total betrayal. So anti-Semitic legislation was imposed not only in France, but in France's colonial realms, which had a huge effect on North Africa, which contained large numbers of Jews. And this resulted in taking French citizenship away from people like Leola Sultan. He lost his job, for example, as a result of these decrees. And Jews were restricted from all sorts of different occupations. There were different legislations that were imposed on local Jews versus Jewish refugees that came in from Europe. That's a whole other really interesting story. But suffice it to say, the Vichy period really pulled the rug out from this idea of the promises, the emancipating promises of colonial France. And so I argue that the Vichy period really acted as a catalyst. It accelerated the pre-existing political conditions and stakes that were already at play in the interwar period. And as I mentioned, in the interwar period, it was possible to be all kinds of things at once, a Zionist, a communist, and pro-French. But critically, after the Second World War, it was no longer possible to be all of those things simultaneously. And Moroccan Jews took different lessons from the period of Vichy persecution. They were increasingly galvanized to support political alternatives from France, but those alternatives increasingly were opposed to one another. And those main alternatives were Zionism as well as communism. For those who were interested in communism, communism came to be the main avenue for Jews to participate in Morocco's national liberation movement from France and from Spain. There were other, of course, nationalist political parties that also gained steam during the Second World War period and immediately after, notably Istiqlal, which just means independence in Arabic. But many of these parties were predicated on Islam in some fashion, based on a sort of Muslim vision of the Moroccan nation. And while they almost all had dictates embracing Jews as part of the Moroccan nation, for those who really wanted to be active in the national liberation movement, disproportionately Jews joined the Moroccan Communist Party. It became the main avenue to express patriotism and that independence spirit. Another major transformation, however, is that in the interwar period, the Moroccan Communist Party was not keen on independence yet. It was actually it was a somewhat pro-French organization, but it transforms radically after the Second World War into becoming a national liberation movement. And some of you may be scratching your head saying, how is it that a communist party is pro-nationalist? And that is also a great question, and I'd be delighted to answer that in the Q&A. But people like this next figure, Edmond Amran el-Malek, who's one of Morocco's most famous novelists. Regrettably, his work has not been translated into English, but down the line, I would love to do a translation of some of his work. He was also one of the leading members of the Moroccan Communist Party during the struggle for national independence. And here you have a quote from him from a Moroccan newspaper, Espoir, Hope. And he says the following: "We are Moroccans. We are not foreigners, as the Zionists would have us believe. We are deeply Moroccan." And that quote should give you an indication that there arose this sort of combativeness between Moroccan Jewish Zionists and Moroccan Jewish communists. For the communists, Zionism represented a betrayal of the Moroccan nation, right? Why look elsewhere? Why you should instead root in Morocco itself. For the Zionists, of course, they saw a very different lesson in the Second World War period and later, saying, actually, there isn't hope for us here in Morocco. We should go elsewhere. So these very different opposing visions for the future of Jews in Morocco. In rejecting French colonial rule, Moroccan Jewish communists identified primarily with Moroccanness as the concept evolved into a national patriotic identity predicated on a narrative of pre-colonial protection under the Sultan, right? That dhimmi status that I mentioned earlier. And with that protection, a legacy of social harmony between Muslims and Jews, right? That's where the Convivencia narrative reemerges. That model of social harmony, in turn, drew on those romanticized narratives of the Convivencia, of Jewish life in medieval Muslim Spain, mapped onto modern Morocco. And so following the Second World War, Moroccan nationalists, including Jews, took advantage of the relative weakness of France, as well as the newly established United Nations, to fight for freedom from French and Spanish colonial rule. At the same time, the Sultan became an important symbolic and then active figure during the war, while the mainstream national liberation organization, Istiqlal, as I just mentioned, issued its manifesto for independence. The Moroccan Communist Party issued its own manifesto for independence very soon after that. And ultimately, every viable political party would come to support a vision of Moroccanness that was bound up with the institution of the Makhzen, or the Sultan, and its inner circle. And the Communist Party itself appealed to Jews for a number of different reasons. As I mentioned, it initially came as a result of an anti-fascist impulse among Moroccan Jews and became a kind of national liberation movement after the war. But one of the primary reasons why the Moroccan Communist Party appealed to Jews was its universalist and expansive definition of what Moroccan meant, or what it would mean to be a Moroccan citizen, when most national liberation parties foregrounded an Arabo-Muslim Moroccan national identity. And while the meaning of Moroccanness itself evolved over time, for Moroccan Jewish communists, it meant embracing Moroccan cultural and national identity formations to the exclusion of all others. In other words, embracing Moroccanness entailed a commitment to Moroccanize and reject French, Spanish, or Zionist politics as threats to the Moroccan nation and Jews as an integral part of it. It meant a pluralistic Morocco free to develop its full potential and a narrative of pre-colonial Muslim-Jewish peaceful coexistence. And in fighting for independence, through a universalist party that defined Moroccanness broadly, Jews fought to demonstrate their authenticity as Moroccans and their belonging to the Moroccan nation. As a result, they demonstrated the legitimacy of the monarchy as their primary protector in the figure of the commander of the faithful, or the Amir al-Mu'minin in Arabic, the Sultan himself, who became the king. And here is a photo of Simone Levy's library card. I just think it's great to see a young photo of him. And he was one of the primary fighters for that vision, along with Edmond Amran el-Maleh. While during the late 1950s through the 1990s, prominent Moroccan Jews rejected specific policies of the monarchy in its turn toward authoritarianism, they did not attack the legitimacy of the monarchy itself. They fought for an idealized vision of Morocco, while simultaneously the vast majority of Moroccan Jews were leaving the country. And in that moment, as the vast majority of Jews were leaving, the Moroccan Jewish communists doubled down on Moroccan patriotism. And this is where the sort of latter chapters of the book come in. There are tremendous splits within the left, and I'm happy to elaborate on what that is, but ultimately you find leading Jewish figures in the left arguing vociferously among one another about the best way to handle an increasingly authoritarian Moroccan state. Figures like Simone Levy chose a more accommodationist track, working with the state to a degree. Figures like Abraham Serfati, you see here, figures like Abraham Serfati chose to work against the state and its authoritarianism, which would land him in prison for about 20 years. But I'll get to that in a couple of minutes. And there were also tremendous splits about the Moroccan polity during the Cold War, right? How and whether to deal with the United States, how, whether, to what degree to deal with Israel, what relationships should be like within the wider Arab world, including with figures like Gamal Abdel Nasser, who very famously in 1961 visited Casablanca. And this resulted in a tremendous amount of violence against the Jews living in Casablanca. So there was another wave of migration as a result of that. In the same time, there were 2 attempted coups against the King Hassan II, who was really the one who ushered in this period of authoritarianism. And there were also disagreements among Jews about the so-called Green March, right? The Moroccan territorial claim of Western Sahara, and Simone Levy would be one of the major figures to lead Jews as part of that march. He was in the vanguard of Moroccans marching into Western Sahara on behalf of the state, while other prominent leftist Jews like Abraham Serfati were languishing in prison precisely because they opposed the Moroccan takeover of Western Sahara. And it's interesting, right? Well, the vast majority of Moroccan Jews left. Most Moroccan Jews did not embrace communism. These figures that had been politically marginal for so much of their lives would ultimately become the very emblems of tolerance and patriotic heroism in contemporary Morocco today. So here, if you read French, I'm happy to put this up a little bit longer, but here you can see a list of a number of those Moroccan communist and leftist leaning figures with a declaration pushing both against Zionist propaganda and anti-Semitic propaganda that combined Jews and Zionism in the same boat. So they're really caught between, and you can see this in a number of their political documents. And this kind of declaration would have been circulated across synagogues and Jewish homes and also Muslim political spaces. Here is Simone Levy. So as part of that accommodationist strategy that I mentioned, working with the state, Simone Levy actually was able to run for public office, and he won. And here you can see his campaign poster in 1976. This is when the Communist Party had changed names. If you can read the Arabic, it becomes really the Party for Progress and Socialism, but it's fundamentally the same cast of characters. Here is Abraham Serfati. He had also been part of the PCM. And if you read the French, right, those who don't play this game, like those who don't play the game of the Moroccan state. In other words, he, because of his disagreement with people like Simone Levy, founded further leftist organizations, including Ila Alamam, which just means forward in Arabic. And it's that organization of really sort of not quite Maoist, but much further to the left even than the Jews involved in the Moroccan Communist Party. That's what really landed him in prison for about 20 years, and critically for opposing the Moroccan takeover of Western Sahara. And here I have this wonderful amount. It's very hard to choose images for these talks because there's so many wonderful ones. But Abraham Serfati, as a result, became this celebrity in the leftist world against the oppression of the regime of Hassan II. It says, in the land where the sun is king, women and men disappear in the shadow of the kingdom. Hassan II, king of Morocco, is detaining the oldest political prisoner in the world, since not oldest in terms of age, longest held political prisoner in the world since the liberation of Nelson Mandela, right? So this is the early 1990s, but really putting him in the context. But very critically, Serfati would become a famous figure among leftist circles, but you'd never see a peep among Moroccan Jewish diaspora organizations about Serfati and his treatment in prison. In fact, he was very much a pariah among Jews, Moroccan Jews internationally. Same thing was true even of Simone Levy, even though he had been at the vanguard of this patriotic Green March to take over the Western Sahara. So most Jews really wanted to distance themselves from these figures. And part of the paradox I'm interested in is how they then became these emblems of the Moroccan state, despite the fact that they really occupied a kind of pariah status for so much of their political careers. Another one, Sion Asidon, he was also of that later vanguard, was also in prison alongside Abraham Serfati. He also was part of the campaigns of Amnesty International and other international human rights organizations to liberate them from prison. Here's another piece of great propaganda from that period. This is from the National Union of Students in Morocco. And if you look close, you say, okay, in Morocco, there's more than just oranges and sunshine, advancing for the liberation of all political prisoners of Morocco. And you see there's this orange, right, a typical Moroccan export abroad. You can even see the Moroccan little sticker on the side of the orange. But it's cut out to show these prisoners jammed against the bars. It says in Morocco, there are also trials, and it lists the number of trials, and 150 collective centuries of imprisonment have been distributed to these figures. There were political disappearances, all of these things. And so it really represents a rupture within Jewish politics. Here's yet another fantastic example criticizing tourism and exchanges between Morocco, France, and Spain. You see workers out, tourists in, and figures like Abraham Serfati, you can see here, imprisoned at the same time, right? Really implicating the Moroccan state and tourism with the imprisonment of figures like Serfati. Okay, so I'll put this here. Drora, how am I doing on time? How many minutes do I have left, out of curiosity?
If you want to finish up now and give time for questions, another 3-4 minutes, that would be great.
Okay, perfect. So those are really the main figures of the book. And so you can see it's this huge sweeping narrative. And here I just want to give you a couple last images. This is how, Morocco, or Jewish Morocco, has really become the subject of national fascination, including the revolutionary ones, right? This magazine issue, Zaman, it just means time. It's one of the main history magazines in Morocco. Moroccan Jews and revolutionaries, these people who most Moroccan Jews would never agree to have them represent Moroccan Jews abroad, they somehow became these representatives of the nation, and Moroccan exceptionalism and participation of Jews in the Moroccan national liberation movement. And I'll close with Simone Levy yet again. When he died, he got basically a state funeral. He had political envoys attending his funeral. He received a massive amount of attention. Simone Levy, the death of a symbol, Talkel, is one of Morocco's main newspapers and magazines. Moroccan Jew, anti-Zionist, anti-Islamist, and communist. He was a unique person unto himself. Right. And so you see these really outpourings of homages for figures like Simone Levy. He, along with Abraham Serfati, along with Edmond Amran al-Maleh, they all have received this outsized amount of attention in Moroccan public life. And so I hope I've convinced you, right, that characters like Simone Levy, Abraham Serfati, Edmond Amran al-Maleh, and others illustrate the fact that while the Moroccan Jewish communists might have been very small in number, their voices speak extremely loudly from the margins, and that they are a critical part of telling the story and complicating the story of not only Moroccan Jewish life in the 20th century, but global Jewish histories across the 20th century. So thank you very much for your time and attention, and I do hope I've left enough time for questions.
I think that's perfect. Thank you so much. I'm going to let you take a drink and catch your breath for a moment. And in the meantime, I do want to say thank you to our partner on this series, the Yeshiva University Rabbi Arthur Schneier Program for International Affairs of Yeshiva University. And Professor Perellis is here as well. And I'm going to invite you all to open your microphones and your cameras if you so wish. It is up to you. You are just invited. But you can ask your questions. There are 2 questions there already. And also, so you should all be getting permission right now to talk. And sorry, it'll take me a minute. So everybody take a moment, review the next things coming up. But Professor Heckman, if you want to start with the questions that are already in the Q&A, that would be fine too.
Yeah, so there's Q&A as well as chat. So I'll do the chat ones first, and then I'll do the Q&A.
Chat is more talking, although Professor Brentstetter did say hi.
Who's talking?
No, I'm saying that it's mostly, chat is mostly just.
Oh, yeah, got it. Okay. Okay, did most Jews who stayed in Morocco do for so ideological or economic reasons? That's a great question. Both. So the small minority of people that I'm talking about, right? I will never claim that the Moroccan Jewish communists are representative of Moroccan Jews as a whole. I think they are an interesting emblematic part of that story. They stayed, so the people I'm talking about, they stayed for ideological reasons. Others, some of the Moroccan Jews remaining today, stayed for largely economic reasons. They tended to be the very wealthiest, tended to stay in Morocco, the ones who had more to lose by leaving. Whereas it was mostly the poorer Jews that left, not universally, but many more poorer Jews that left Morocco to go to Israel, or to a smaller number to France or Canada. How many members did the Moroccan Communist Party have at its largest? Great question. The numbers are really hard to pin down. So based on the kind of contradictory reporting that I get, both from the Communist Party itself and police surveillance reports that I look at its height, it may have had several thousand. At its low point, certainly many fewer. It had a sort of spike in membership after the immediate post-World War II period, but then that dropped precipitously in the later 50s and into the 1960s. And other leftist parties really took up the mantle, more like union organizations, people like Mehdi Ben Barka, if you're familiar with him. Please address the parallels between Jews in the Moroccan communist parties and Jewish communists who fought against the apartheid in South Africa. Thank you. I love this question. I'm working on an edited volume that is really engaged with comparative 20th century histories of Jews and radical politics, because you're absolutely right. This is a phenomenon across so many different places for different reasons. But there is something to this question of Jews in the left in the 20th century. So I'm working on an edited volume now, and one of our contributors is writing on exactly that question. So I'll say, invite me back for another book talk when that comes out, and I can tell you more about that then. Are there any other Jewish political prisoners in Morocco today? No, I'm guessing you mean other than Abraham Serfati for that time period. I mean, Sion Asidon and Abraham Serfati were really the most prominent ones. There were none that had that sort of level of international engagement that I'm aware of, although lots of others had been imprisoned in earlier eras, particularly under French colonial rules. But Simone Levy himself, he didn't mention for being a subject of the state's scrutiny, but there was this massive upheaval in Casablanca, for example, in 1965, and he was basically kidnapped off the streets for 8 days. Idea where he was, and then he was sort of dumped unceremoniously on his doorstep early in the morning after some period of time. He suffered negative health consequences from that period for the remainder of his life. He was forced to drink bleach diluted with water. That was a very common torture technique that the Makhzen employed during that time. And that's, a sort of lesser known case, right? He wasn't in the prison for like 20 years or 10 years like some of these others. But, another thing, Abraham Serfati's son was placed in political prison for doing nothing but be related to Abraham Serfati, okay? So there are these smaller stories for sure. Okay, I'm trying to keep track of both the Q&A and the chats. So now I'm looking at mostly the Q&A. Okay. I noticed you mentioned in your book Sadiq Ben Daoud. He was also resistant during November 8, 1942 events led to the Allied landings. I'm in contact with his youngest son. Yeah, please connect with me over email. You can find it on the UCSC Jewish Studies website, or I can type it in a minute or something like that, but I would love to be in contact with that. Okay, am I missing questions? Did they all stay in Morocco throughout their lives? No, most of them did, the figures that I write about, but Edmond Amran al-Maleh critically did not. He left, it's an interesting story about him. The main Secretary General of the Moroccan Communist Party was a Muslim by the name of Ali Yatta, but he was in political exile during much of the critical period of agitation for national independence. And I argue that Edmond Amran al-Maleh was really one of the most critical leaders in that time period. After independence, I think he was hoping for a more elevated level or recognition for his role in that movement, but he did not get it. He was disenchanted with the party for ideological reasons and also for perhaps other more personal reasons. And so he actually left during that uprising in Casablanca in 1965 that I mentioned, actually, and he went into self-imposed exile in France. And he only returned when King Hassan II died in 1999. And since then, he's become this really hailed national figure, but he left for a good period of that time. Women and feminist political activists, queer matters. I'm not so much, that's a good question. I'm not aware of so much queer political discussion within the Moroccan Communist Party, but I can say there were a lot of really wonderful women involved, and they're not as prominent in the archival material as I would have liked, and that's a typical problem for historians and particularly political movements. But Encarnacion Levy, she was this amazing figure. She was married to Simone Levy. She distributed propaganda around town. She held these sorts of soirees for communist activists in their apartment in Casablanca. Abraham Serfati's sister, Evelyn Serfati, she was also a very, very prominent activist, and she was also kidnapped off the streets and tortured for a good period of time. And she too died a couple years after that. And her ailments that she suffered after that were largely attributed to the torture that she suffered in that time period. In different eras, women were very involved in education initiatives that the Communist Party put on, soup kitchens, all kinds of different activities. Okay, and then let's see. How can we understand the overlay, the important critique of settler colonialism in Israel, which Jewishly is often situated as Euro-heritage Jews applied to Mizrahi Jews? How to place the Jewish Moroccan internalization of the colonial context throughout French and even Euro-communist impact for Moroccan Jews? That is a big question. It's a really big question and subject for a book unto itself. I, at one point, thought about following this story to Moroccan Jews who went to Israel, because there were lots of Moroccan Jewish communists who went to Israel for all different kinds of reasons, right? One didn't necessarily have to be a gung-ho Zionist to go to Israel. They were following their families. They were following social networks. People also changed their minds. There were all kinds of different reasons why people would have gone. And some of them became involved in leftist organizations. Many of them did not, as you might be familiar today. I mean, the political right in Israel today, I mean, it's very dominated to an extent by Mizrahi Jews of Mizrahi descent from across the region for a number of really complicated issues, that some of which might have to do with the colonial context, but I would argue many of which are come after, actually, and as a result of their living conditions once upon arrival in Israel, and a sense of betrayal by the labor-dominated government that they were met with upon arrival in Israel. So, you know, there's the moment of the election of Menachem Begin, right? The sort of big earthquake, so to speak, that flips Israeli politics. And a lot of that is attributed to Mizrahi political disenchantment with the Labor Party in Israel. Okay, what was the legacy of Jews in the Moroccan Communist Party to the political stance of Jewish communities in Morocco, especially today under King Mohammed VI? Excellent. Yeah, so that's where my book title comes from, really, because it's that they're so, I mean, most of them are unfortunately deceased now, who are really active in the Moroccan nationalist movement, but they are really upheld as national heroes. It's under the rule of Mohammed Sadis, right, Mohammed VI, that these figures like Simone Levy gets a foundation in his name. El Male has a foundation in his name. Serfati, I mean, all of these figures, they're the subject of Moroccan televised documentaries. They get this massively disproportionate amount of state attention relative to the fact that so many Moroccan Jews really disliked them and really wanted to disassociate from them. It's a very interesting paradox. So they do quite well in terms of public memory. I mean, if you talk to, I mean, there are a lot of historians in Morocco that work on the Jewish past, and they will all know these figures, and they are very much applauded in contemporary Moroccan public memory. Other questions? I'd love to hear other people's voices too.
We don't hear you, Marla, for some reason. No, we don't hear you.
Okay. I don't know.
Oh, there we go. Now we hear you.
Okay, great. Thank you, Alma. So I want to clarify that question about the overlay of colonialism. In part, what I'm thinking about is the important story about settler colonialism in the context of Israel, thinking of Euro heritage to Mizrahi Jews. As important as the conversation is, continues, of course, to silence. It's not coming from narratives generally, from amongst different Mizrahi individuals and communities. And what you're bringing in here is when you are looking at communities before they travel, you can't presume that they have an internalized colonialist of themselves. And of course, if you're looking at the Jewish community with my French is terrible, but the French alliance was so important, certainly Morocco throughout most of the region. So how can we start to shift that conversation to include, and if it's part holding accountable, that's great. And if it's more critique, whatever it is, it's fine. But it currently completely leaves out any kind of agency and participation, either for or against conscious or unconscious settler colonialist projects that happen for Jews within MENA contexts.
No, you're right. I mean, there is this sort of cutting off of a prehistory. And one of the things that motivated me, one of the things that really motivated me with this book is the fact that the history of Moroccan Jewish outmigration is generally couched in this way that Jews are sort of the passive subjects of history. Either they're pushed by the winds of French imperialism or pushed by the winds of Zionism, right? And it depends on who you talk to. According to the Moroccan state, or somebody like Simone Levy would say, there are three major factors why Moroccan Jews left. And it's the fault of the Alliance, it's the fault of the Zionists, and it's the fault of the French colonialists. But if you talk to many Moroccan Jews or Jews of Moroccan descent in Israel today, I don't think they would have that same narrative, right? There's a very different set of narratives that comes about. They say, well, no, it has more to do with, violence against Jews because of regional political alliances against Israel, right? It has more to do with wars of 48 and 67 and so forth. And then there's a totally different narrative, right, that also collapses a history of was it relentless persecution of Jews in Morocco? No, but neither was it, total harmony with Jews either, right? That's the problem. There are these really bifurcated maximalist narratives on either side of this thing that I really love these people, to study these people, because they walk a really tricky line. They walk a really tricky line across all of these different narratives simultaneously. So I totally agree with you that bringing that past to bear and bringing those lives in thinking about the Jews from Morocco in Israel today, right? These very sophisticated political pasts and what that means for their activism or their political life in Israel today really, really matters, right? And as you say, the internalization of colonial tropes, absolutely, right? The sense of a French education, right? And the Iraqi Jews are also a great case for this. Dorit Bashkin has done a lot of really wonderful writing about this and thinking about the Iraqi Jewish communists that went to Israel and, who had lived so well, relatively speaking, in Iraq for the most part, and then plummeted to the bottom of a social hierarchy, and the difficulties that they faced with that. So it's I don't know if I've really answered your questions, but they're really interesting, and I'd love to keep talking about them over email or something like that. Okay, I see another thing. Okay. Looking for the book, What Happened to the Jewishness of Moroccan Jewish Communists? How did they deal with questions of Jewish language, about the oppression of Jews as workers? To what extent does it appear that the Moroccan state has instrumentalized the legacy of Moroccan Jewish communists to shore up a national narrative? Oh, yes. Part two, second part of the question is the subject of my 5th book chapter. Totally. I not to be overly cynical. And that's why I say, because I don't, it's back to this problem of agency. I think Moroccan Jewish communists.
Sorry, not everybody's reading the question.
Sorry. That part 2 has to do with the Moroccan state's instrumentalization of Moroccan Jewish communists and their legacy. Absolutely. It very much has to do with Morocco's positioning in the world. And it has to do also with Cold War politics. It's very much intermingled. The instrumentalization of Moroccan Jewish tourism, the sort of exceptionalism narrative of Morocco in the region, particularly vis-a-vis places like Algeria, for a number of reasons. Morocco and Algeria are these bitter rivals and enemies, despite small periods of collaboration in the past. So Morocco really positions itself as quite distinct. So in shorthand, I would say read the 5th chapter, but yes, to a great extent. The first question, Jewishness of Moroccan Jewish communists. Yeah, that's a really wonderful question. How do they basically identify as Jews, and how do they relate to Jews as workers? This is the thing, they're very harsh against most Moroccan Jews. A lot of that declaration, I know I went by it kind of quickly, but they're yelling at quite a lot of people a lot of the time, I have to say. I'm not sure it's the most persuasive tactic. But they say basically Moroccan Jews do better to perform your patriotism. You need to come out en masse. You need to be part of this movement. You need to do this, that, and the other. Also reject all Zionism. Then they're also yelling at Moroccan Muslims, saying, do not let any sort of collapsing of Zionism and anti-Semitism enter your politics. Don't allow this, don't allow that, don't allow any sort of racism. And they're right on that point. That is totally in keeping with their ideological position. But some of them identify very much with Jewishness. Simone Levy was one of them, right? He completely thought that Moroccan identity was utterly bound up with Jewishness, and there was no way to separate them. People like Abraham Serfati claimed in an interview once that, somebody asked him, what did you think when the vast majority of Moroccan Jews were leaving in the 1950s and 60s? And he said, I was too busy. I wasn't really thinking about them, which seems kind of surprising and unlikely. But then, in his older age, he really thinks quite critically about his Jewishness and really identifies with his Jewishness. Edmond Amran and Malé, in his novels, he's constantly circling around this question of his Jewishness, of his family's Jewishness, his relationship to the Moroccan state. So they all have very fraught relationships to Jewishness, to their Moroccanness, and they all have different arguments about reconciling those things. Simone Levy is perhaps the most straightforward. I mean, he was a scholar who also wrote a lot about Judeo-Spanish, about Hakitiya and Judeo-Arabic. I mean, he made the most concerted, consistent academic as well as political argument about the coeval nature of Jewishness and Moroccanness. I would say the other figures are much more complex, not to the degree of an Isaac Deutscher non-Jewish Jew, but complex in their own rights.
Heather. Okay, well, that was, I really appreciated that, and thank you very much. And I think the one thing that I'm going to walk away with is this conflict between all the different parts of who you are, and I think that comes up in so many different groups and so many different time periods. So that really helps put, not in context, but actually break open the context.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, these groups are not monoliths. I think that's one of the most important things to take away. No political group is a monolith. No individual member of a political group is a monolith either.
Right.
Yeah.
So thank you again, and thank you all for coming. And it really, I hope to see you at future events as well, and actually you as well, Professor Heckman. So,
yeah. Thank you all so much, and buy the book for at least your library. And if anybody needs, you can even put it in the chat. Actually, I forgot to do that, but it's on the Zoom, the link to the book.
Yeah.
All right, perfect. Well, thank you all so much.
For a link to the book, and I encourage you all to go out and buy it.
Yes, and it's also available by ebook.
Oh, there you go.
All right, thank you all so much.
Have a good evening, day, whatever,
Bye.
wherever you are in the world. Bye-bye. Thanks.